Hello everybody. Today we're going to be talking about a period in time known as the Progressive Era. And this particular PowerPoint is going to deal with or talk about working conditions and how some of those working conditions were changed. You have two learning targets for this section. One is I can describe how workers began to organize and demand improvements in working conditions and pay. And then I can describe how people worked to improve living conditions and address child labor. So we're going to cover those things. Some of the stuff we'll cover in class, but this is going to be the main information, the foundation stuff. Progressives. Progressives work to solve problems of the quickly growing cities and industries. Some of the problems that were coming about were things like crime, disease, poverty. There was overcrowding in the cities. There wasn't very good education. There are a lot of kids working, and they were working in conditions that were very dangerous. And then there was a lot of corruption in business and government. And so we're going to cover how progressives dealt with this. Progressives were a group of people who tried to change those things. Now, we have to talk about new businesses. During this time period, we've talked about immigrants moving to the United States. We've talked about cities growing. During this time period, those immigrants, when they came to the United States, they worked in these businesses. They worked in the steel industry. They worked in the railroad industry. They worked in the oil industry. And those businesses began to grow. And here you can see pictured three of the major business owners of this time, three industrialists as they were called. Leland Stanford on the left. Here's Leland Stanford. Stanford University is named after him. He was part of the railroad industry and creating the railroad that went across the country. The next guy here is Andrew Carnegie, or sometimes you hear his name pronounced Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was a leader in the steel industry. And then on the right is a man named John D. Rockefeller, who was a leader in the oil industry. And so these guys, their businesses begin to grow. Many immigrants work, especially for Andrew Carnegie. Many immigrants work for these guys and help their business prosper. Businesses start to see their employees, during this time, the businesses start to see their employees as interchangeable parts. So if one employee is hurt or injured or can't work, they can put another employee in that same job and not lose a beat. They believed in something that was called social Darwinism, which was the survival of the fittest. If you were strong enough to work at that job and be safe in that job, then you were going to survive. If you weren't strong enough, then you would get hurt or injured and lose your job, and you weren't someone to be worried about. And so this belief system didn't provide help for injured workers. And so if you got injured, you were stuck. You couldn't work your job anymore, and you didn't get any help from the business, which is where you were injured. And the businesses, the reason they grew is they tried to pay their workers as little as possible so that they could get more money to help grow their business. Some of the problems with this is that many jobs where workers, in these businesses, there were many jobs where workers didn't need many skills. Assembly line jobs, jobs that were the same thing over and over each day. And after about 10, 12, 13 hours, you might become tired. And if you're not as focused, usually it's because you're tired, you start to lose focus, and next thing you know, your fingers are caught in a machine, or something, something horrible happens, or you slip and fall on something you wouldn't have normally fallen on. Most of these jobs were low paying and long hours, and they were often dangerous. Many new immigrants took these jobs, and many of these workers were children. Many of the workers who were injured, and many of them lived short lives because of how long they had to work in such horrible conditions. And when they came home, things didn't get better. They came home to live in run-down apartments, these tenement buildings that were broken down and overcrowded. Eventually, workers get together with each other and they form what are called unions. And the unions allowed all the workers to negotiate with the owners or management. Sometimes the unions would use tactics like strikes, where all employees refused to work, and this was to try to achieve their goals. But sometimes the strikes turned violent. And when this happened, the workers usually did not receive their demands. And so when a strike turned violent, it was not good for the workers who were striking. Some of the examples of strikes that turned into violence, the Haymarket riot in Chicago, the Homestead strike in Pennsylvania, and the Pullman strike in Chicago are all examples of this violence that erupts during a time of strikes. And in all three of those situations, the workers lose out in that particular situation. Now, some changes do occur. Conditions start to improve after tragedies, like the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire. We're going to talk about that one in depth in class. When tragedies like that happen, it causes people to take notice of some of the horrible conditions, and so after those tragedies, conditions start to improve. Conditions also improve with the help of journalists who got a nickname called muckrakers, because they would write stories about these horrible living and working conditions. And they were called muckrakers is because as they wrote their stories, it was like they were kicking up the dust and the muck so that people would be aware of what's going on. Eventually, the standard workday went from 6 days a week for 12 to 14 hours a day to 5 days a week for 8 hours a day. Pay eventually increases, and injured workers begin to receive some help. So there are some positive changes, but it takes a lot of years. It takes a number of tragedies before those conditions begin to improve. If you have any questions about this stuff, please come see me in class. Otherwise, we'll talk to you in class. Thanks.